Thanks for being here bright and early. Welcome to day 2 of Washington Weekend. Yay. We are going to get started with our amazing panel for you guys this morning. I just wanted to greet you, say thanks for being here, thanks for your attention. I hope you had a great time at our press club dinner last night. It was wonderful celebrating you all and just having everyone together. So that's all to say, welcome. Thanks for being here. We have another great day of panels and presentations for you guys. And now I'm going to hand it over to Karima to introduce our first panel of the day.
Thank you, Libby. Welcome, everybody. I hope you had a good night last night, and we're ready to go today. This is the first of several panels, as Libby said, so we just look for engagement. Ask your questions. We'll have time for that. We'll be asking our panelists a few questions in round-robin style, and then we'll open up the floor for you to ask any questions that you may have. So let me start with my introductions first. Make sure I have your titles perfectly correct here. Adam Ambrogi, Chief of External Affairs with the League of Women Voters of the United States. Thank you, Adam. Next to Adam is Deborah Barfield Berry, National Correspondent for USA Today and a Pulitzer Prize winner. Kadia Goba, political reporter from Semafor and a Reporting Fellows alum. And last, of course, but not least, is Nadine Strossen, John Marshall Harlan II, Professor of Law, Emerita at New York Law School and the past president of the American Civil Liberties Union. So welcome, panelists. Just to kind of kick things off, if you could just describe briefly your work, the work that you do, and how it's relevant to politics and voting rights and free speech. So I'll just start with Adam.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Adam Ambrogi, he, him pronouns, Chief of External Affairs of the League of Women Voters. Very happy to be here, very excited. It takes a lot to get me up in the morning on Saturday. And when I heard the invite, I was like, oh, you all are awesome. You're going to do amazing things. So no way I'm missing it, especially this panel, some of whom I've worked with and around for a number of years. So at the League, stepping back a second, League, 104-year-old organization created to promote women's suffrage, heavily involved in the passage of the 19th Amendment, not, when it got started, did not actually do the job of getting all women the right to vote. And we have to make sure that it is clear that the women that started this movement for a while did not help Black and brown women get the right to vote. And this is something that, of the modern League, we are dealing with it. We're being clear about it. We're bringing that into the spaces that we're at. And we're working to, certainly change how we show up and engage on that. We're a tri-federated organization. I'm in national in DC. We're looking legally, organizationally, and from a democracy perspective around the country, both federal and national, different from federal. What's going on in all of the states? What are the trends happening? We have state leagues, 50 state leagues. They're in the capitals generally. They're looking what's going on in the state legislatures. They're understanding, and building relationships with the state reporters, with election officials, with the legislatures in every state. And then we have local leagues, 750 of them, every congressional district, doing work on civic education, voter information, voter registration drives, you name it. In September, we had 1,100 news hits on, quote, League of Women Voters, end quote. Too much for me to understand what all those 1,100 stories are about. Most of them are actually local papers, not unlike New York Times, Washington Post all the time. But they're all sorts of things happening. It's my job to help try to understand what those things are, talk about the League as core civic infrastructure for the country, help the League transform as we are in this moment where the leagues need to reflect the communities that they work on. They need to be able to speak and to different generations than they previously spoke at. And they need to be more aggressive, quite frankly, at the state of democracy and pushing back on what needs to be done in this moment to protect our democracy. We are nonpartisan. We do not endorse candidates or parties or oppose candidates or parties, but we stand on issues and will fight for specific issues that we care about. We've had a 50-year-old position on reproductive rights and access to abortion. We've had positions over the years on gun control, environmental issues, and of course, we have a whole series of issues that we care about related to democracy, voting rights. We have started and kicked off our campaign this year to end the Electoral College as an antiquated system and focus on one person, one vote as the league. We know it's going to be a long time, but we believe as folks that helped bring around the 19th Amendment, it is worth fighting for because land should not vote, people should vote. I'm excited to be here. I'll pause here and turn it over. Thank you all.
Thank you, Adam. Deb?
So as Karima said, I'm a national correspondent with USA Today. So I'm based here in D.C. But this year I'm on the election enterprise team. And all y'all know what enterprise team, right? So that gives me an opportunity to do a lot of different things in the horse race coverage, which means for us, our team, we get to go out and write stories about voters. We get to write stories about get out the vote, GOTV stuff. We get to write stories about voters of color, who's targeting them, who's not targeting them, misinformation, disinformation, all that kind of stuff. So it gives me lots of room to do lots of different stories, which is fun these days. But as you can imagine, is crazy. The cycle has been crazy, the coverage has been crazy, what we do is crazy. But beyond that, I used to cover Congress, national politics, so I know all that. I used to do a lot of stuff on the ground, in the streets, so I know that as well. My specialty, we never say specialty in journalism, but my lane is voting rights and civil rights, which, as you can imagine, gives me plenty to write about these days, which also leads me into democracy sometimes. And depending on who you talk to, what does it even mean? What's that look like? What are we fighting for? But that gives me plenty to write about too. So this year, if we're talking about democracy, we're talking about voting rights and elections, and election integrity. I just came from Georgia yesterday. Y'all know what that's going to be. It's going to be crazy. I might be going back to Georgia the week before elections. So that's the kind of stuff I've been working on.
Thank you.
Kadia. I'm also a political journalist. I work for Semafor, and unlike Deborah, I am all into the horse racing of politics. Right now, I'm a congressional reporter, but right now I'm doing a lot of campaign reporting, obviously, with the turnover, Kamala Harris and against Donald Trump. You know, Semafor, we turned 2 this week, 2 years old, so it's a new company. I've been doing this for about 5 years, but essentially, they kind of sought to, you know, bring transparency to news, and you'll see in our platform we do news where we state the news at the top, and then we'll say like Kadia's view, which is essentially some of the stuff that gets mixed in an article. So we try to make the distinction between like our opinion, not necessarily what's in our head, but based on who we've talked to, but acknowledging we haven't talked to all the people, and like not everyone agrees with the thesis that we have at the top. So we'll have sometimes we'll have a room for disagreement. So those are some of the things, as far as this panel is concerned, that Semafor does to kind of, you know, push back against disinformation, just like the confusing time of news right now.
Wow. I would like to stand so I can see folks in the back. I won't do this for all of my remarks, but it's a remarkable panel and a remarkable group of participants. I looked at the list of where you come from and what you're working on, and it's dazzling. It's just such a diverse group of institutions and a fascinating array of topics. There are quite a few that I would really, really like to view myself. If I had to choose one, I hope that the journalists will seek me out. It's the one about Columbia encampments, because my husband is a professor at Columbia. We live right around the corner, and I'm constantly speaking on the campus lecture circuit about this topic. By the way, at the Yale Political Union, this is just an example of the kinds of things I've been talking about. I was asked to do a debate on encampments, and whether they should be banned. And I opposed banning them. So I will keep an open mind to whatever you are depicting. But so I think I'm affiliated with a number of organizations, but I think the most important, because it's the largest and oldest, is the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union. And I'll take a leaf from Adam's book and giving you a little bit of information about that really important organization, which is doing, unfortunately, well, it's fortunate that it's doing the work. It's unfortunate that it has to do so much work to counter voter suppression measures that have been enacted all over the country. And the good news is that the ACLU can go to court, is going to court, is winning some battles, but not all of them. These are heavily fact-specific cases, and the law is not nearly as positive as we wish it would be. The ACLU, like the League of Women Voters, is strictly nonpartisan, never endorsing or opposing any candidate, any party, any official. I think it's quite famous or infamous that we will defend everybody's rights, even the rights to free speech and due process and other fundamental freedoms for people and organizations that are themselves using their rights to crusade against civil liberties. And that's always a very controversial position, but it's one that I continue to be deeply committed to. I was talking with Adam about, he was the student editor-in-chief of a journal called Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. And to me, the two are inextricable. I do not believe that you can have voting rights, equal rights, women's rights, any other rights in the world unless we have an extremely robust freedom of speech that is robust enough to extend to what some people consider to be hateful speech, dangerous speech, extremist speech, because when you know history, or even some current examples, you will see that those stigmatizing terms have been used against the civil rights movement. They were certainly used against abolitionists. They are used today against the Black Lives Matter movement. And for all the potential harms and dangers of robust free speech, which are significant, including in terms of disinformation, I continue to believe, based on experience, that it's even more dangerous to give government officials a discretionary power that they predictably, consistently, disproportionately enforce against minority voices and views. I love democracy. But there is a downside to majoritarian control, and that's why our framers added the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment, that there are some freedoms that are so fundamental that no majority can take them away from any minority, no matter how despised they are. So if I'll just say one more thing, I stopped being ACLU president quite a few years ago, but I continue to be very, very closely involved. I just this morning was emailing with the National Executive Director and Legal Director. I'm on its advisory committee. But in the recent past, I have focused my time specifically on free speech, academic freedom, and civil discourse, because starting about 10 years ago, I saw increasing illiberalism in the sense of closed-mindedness coming from both ends of the political spectrum. And you know how passionately I feel that without free speech, we're not going to have any other human rights. So I've been devoting myself full-time to that particular cluster of issues, speaking on campuses all over the country, other forums all over the country, and you have such enormous power to make such a difference by raising your voices to enable other people to raise their voices in an influential way. So I would have gotten up at 3 in the morning to speak to this group.
Nadine. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, Adam sent me a flyer about a week ago with definitions and for information, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So if you could just kind of break down those three, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, just for our audience, so we're all kind of on the same page. Thank you.
You want me to?
Oh, yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. Well, and so misdis has been used interchangeably. I think that, well, not interchangeably, sorry, frequently recently, but malinformation has come into the game more recently. And I use the definitions that the CISA, the government agency that deals with cybersecurity, and it's increasingly been, sadly, because it gets a lot more money than some of the other election agencies, it can actually put good ideas and some definitional work and some communications work into the sort of public stream here. So misinformation, I'll try to get this right, is false, but not created or shared with the intention of causing harm. Disinformation is deliberately created to mislead, harm, or manipulate a person, group, organization, or country. And malinformation is information that's created on based on fact, but used out of context or with snippets directly to mislead, harm, or manipulate. And so the malinformation can be something that is a piece of an actual speech by someone that's completely out of context and sandwiched between two statements that make you think they were talking about something else completely. The statement itself is obviously true, but leads people to a bad direction. And it is around, as you can see from these things, it's around the intent of the person sharing the information. You can have good people unintentionally sharing misinformation. We see it all the time on, social media. And you can have bad actors intentionally sharing factual information for ill ends. And so I think that's the sort of the triumvirate that we're dealing with right now. But that's what they define it as. I don't know how other folks on the panel, whether there's interesting other thoughts about that approach.
I think
Nadine?
that's the conventional definition, and as a law professor, I'm sorry, I just feel so, I don't like standing in front of my panelists, but I feel so uncomfortable not getting to see everybody here, so please forgive me for standing. Let me just tell you that the term has no legal significance, none of these terms. So in that sense, it's a little bit like hate speech or extremist speech, terms that have negative connotations, but do not relate to any category of unprotected speech under the First Amendment. In fact, the Supreme Court has held, people are shocked to hear this, that you essentially have a First Amendment right to lie, outright lie, even intentionally, with relatively few exceptions. And if I can the exceptions will sound familiar to you, but they all require not only the intent, because it's very dangerous to journalists if you are going to be held to a negligence standard, a duty of care, and you face lawsuits for injunctions, prior restraints, damages, sometimes criminal penalties under some statutes that in the past and even fairly recently have imposed negligence liability. So not only intent or at least recklessness, extreme disregard for the truth, and you have the false statement has to be aimed at a particular individual, aiming to harm that individual in some concrete way and resulting in some tangible, demonstrable harm. So I think the best known example is defamation, right? Where you harm somebody's reputation in a way that they can show that they have suffered professionally or financially. But even there, as I'm sure you all know, the famous New York Times versus Sullivan case, when the Supreme Court said, even if it's a false statement, if it relates to a public official or a public figure, we care so much about not deterring journalists from engaging in robust criticism of government officials, because that's at the heart of our democracy, right? We, the people, wield the sovereign power. How can we do that responsibly if we can't criticize those we elect to be accountable to us? And then other examples of punishable false speech are fraud, where somebody loses money because they're relying on a false statement that you've made. And another good example is perjury, when you lie in a court of law. And I guess I'll have a chance to say more about, for all the dangers of disinformation, we really have to, especially in this group, be thinking of how scary it would be if this very vague concept was something that would lead to punishment against those who are trying to cover fast-breaking stories.
I just want to pivot to voting rights. Thank you, Nadine. Just want to pivot to voting rights. And this is for you, Deb. That's kind of like your lane, your area. How well informed do you think the average voter is about their voting rights? And how does this affect their enthusiasm or their apathy toward voting in political elections?
Loaded. So I don't have polls or numbers to quantify or all
Just
that.
from your experience.
From reporting and talking to a lot of advocates and activists, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And in fact, that's those are the areas that many of the groups, especially this election cycle, are targeting or trying to counter. And they're trying to counter that through being proactive in their literature and their campaigns and going out in the streets. They're trying to counter that through social media. They're trying to counter that through particularly young people on campuses. They're doing a lot of stuff on campuses to offer information that is different than what they may be hearing or seeing on TikTok or whatever else, whatever other medium. So they're really, and honestly, they're really worried about that, because whether it's somebody giving them information about the polling site is over across the street when it's really down the street. So they're worried about a lot of that. They're worried about whether they're saying that the polls, early voting starts on October 15th when it started on the 16th. Those kind of things that may seem small, but they're real. And they're real when it comes to turnout. It's real when it comes to people feeling comfortable or believing, which is there's a whole lot of mistrust and distrust of the government, of political parties, of each other, of the candidates, of everything. So they're really worried about all of that. And so instead of just investing in using their energy and resources on get out the vote, they're using a lot of that to make sure their people aren't concerned or worried about misinformation, disinformation. And that's very real and very scary, actually.
Any of the panelists want to chime in? All right, then I'll go to you, Kadia. Right, so, as a journalist, how has the prevalence of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, a new term that I know now, in political campaigns impacted the public trust in journalism?
So just in general, public trust in journalism is at an all-time low. Gallup does an annual review of this, and it just doesn't seem to be getting better. But before I get into that, anyone struggling with misinformation, disinformation, and distinguishing the two, I always use a trick. Misinformation is sort of like a misunderstanding and not meant to deceive someone, like disinformation. So back to how it's eroding public trust in news. This is an ongoing struggle for news organizations on how much we are to amplify wrong information, right? So if there is something that's wrong out there, it is always a battle in a newsroom on, do we report about it and debunk that? Or are we amplifying it when we do report on it and debunk it? Because many people don't get through the entire article, and there is some misunderstanding that we're actually supporting that claim, that false claim that was made. So that is an ongoing issue. Now, many of you are in the news business right now, so this is not for you, because I assume you are reading through the articles and you you don't really struggle with news literacy. But some of your parents or friends and family members who can't make a proper distinction in news, this is where this comes into play, especially when it comes to online articles. There are a bunch of articles that don't have bylines out there, right? A lot of that where you just see staff. That is not a credible news article, because with that, and this is something you have to explain to your friends and family. because anybody putting out some kind of information is not afraid to put their name, their organization, or attached to their name or organization. And that has been a problem. So it's really the root cause is news literacy and how people cannot and do not interpret news, proper news, because here's an example. Right now online, there are full articles or just like, clippings of things that talk about Kamala Harris and, all kind of malicious things about her background, social background, and who she's had relationships with. I can tell you, we've done reporting that there are entire farms or misinformation farms or disinformation farms that are actively pursuing or, paid by really big people and big PACs, actively, pursuing people who are not as engaged as some of you are in actual news literacy and trying to convince them that somehow, or that will obviously sway people's decision on who Kamala Harris is and, her reputation. So those are all very intentional things. This is something we are constantly, newsrooms are constantly trying to overcome, but it's just very difficult because the fact is most people just don't have general news. They don't know how to distinguish real news from fake news, and it's a big problem. So it impacts your decision on who you vote for, whether it's a local election, a town hall, a local election in your area, or the presidential election. It's something we're constantly trying to combat.
Can I ask
Yes.
So with that said, what Kadia just said means it's all the more of our responsibility, your responsibility, to be good journalists. And good journalists means make sure people have the information at the best that you know it, and then the correct information. So for a lot of news organizations, particularly the big, all of us, small ones, big ones, etc., are making a point of, like USA Today, we have a fact-checking team. Boom, a candidate says something, we have a reporter who's going to be on it and give you the facts, yes, no, whatever. You know about PolitiFact, right? Everybody know in this room, right? So they're on it. So we rely on them and hope that people will read them. Not always the case, right. But you as the journalist who's writing the piece, it's on you too. Even when you say a candidate says something, which has been proven false. Mm-hmm. Make sure you say that early on, because like you said, they might not get to the bottom. But if they read your story with your name on it, right, they know that you have already said this has been proven not to be the case or whatever. So it's on all of us to do that. And again, in journalism, for the people who still trust us, or at least look to us, we need to be the credible source and resource. Yeah. So it's still on us to still protect the truth, again, as we see it at this moment, as it is.
If I could weigh in on remedies for some of these problems that have been eloquently laid out. The examples, Deborah, that you gave about misinformation, that would deter somebody from voting or prevent them from voting. And we had examples in the last election where people were told they could vote for Hillary by email, remember? That is a fraud that has been made illegal in many states, and those laws are completely consistent with the First Amendment. They've survived First Amendment challenges appropriately. So there is a legal remedy to that type of disinformation. But some of the other kinds of allegations that are not purely matters of objectively verifiable or falsifiable facts, which is most of what people are concerned about. Matters of opinion, matters of analysis, matters of interpretation, matters of perspective. We have to counter that with more information, including the kind of qualifying language that Deborah talked about, and the kind of media literacy programs that Kadia talked about. And it's not only really unsophisticated people who are incredibly news illiterate. I think all of you, from everything I read, are extraordinary among young people, because most young people, according to surveys and I haven't fact-checked the surveys, I hasten to say, but they allege that most young people don't look at news, aren't interested in news, let alone going to the extra step of doing some fact-checking. And there were some recent studies that have been done at Stanford University of their incoming students who could not even distinguish between a news story and an editorial, an opinion piece or a fact piece. And when you ask them what the criteria they use to ascertain the reliability or truthfulness of a story or a TV media presentation, they would look at the most superficial aspects. If it was well presented, if it looked nice. So, as an activist, I'm an optimist. The optimistic perspective on this is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that a little bit of media literacy education could go a long way. And thanks to the concerns that have been well publicized, thanks to all of my colleagues here and there, some states are even enacting laws that are requiring that critical information literacy skills be taught very systematically starting in K through 12. And I think that's we're never going to completely eliminate, especially malinformation. It's impossible. And so what we have to do is prepare people to anticipate it, to have a healthy amount of skepticism about what they read without dangerous levels of distrust.
Adam, I didn't want to jump in.
Two things reflecting on some of the, just a ton of great ideas from fellow panelists. One, related to Mistis and also the advent of AI coming through. We don't have to go through to last election. The New Hampshire primary saw someone with a couple $1,000, a private actor, someone that pretended to work for another Democratic candidate, that created a robocall that attempted to be President Biden's voice, telling folks to vote on a different day. And it was sent intentionally right before the New Hampshire primary to a bunch of folks. The league, we sued that private actor under civil law, both under Voting Rights Act and consumer protection laws, in ways that I'm not exactly sure whether all my panelists would agree with or not, but because there's no other accountability, and these things happen so quickly, and they're now cheap. They're really cheap to both produce this type of a voice recording as well as to share it and spread it. And so, to me, trying to figure out how we even get the public to understand what's true amongst bad actors that just maybe, I don't think that they thought their third-party Democratic candidate in the New Hampshire primary was ever going to win, but causing chaos or playing around with the process that has a suppressive and discriminatory impact on the vote, I think is really something that we have to wrestle with as a country. The other thing that I'm as on the activist side of things, not on the reporter side, that I struggle with and wonder if I could sort of punt back to the amazing journalists on the panel is headlines. If people are reading their news and reading their Twitter feed or whatever feed, and all they're taking away is the headline. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but some people do it. I sometimes do it. And the headline writers are done by editors are poor, misleading, or meant to just get clicks. How do you push back? How do you deal with that?
Adam just threw us under the bus, right? Not us. Now you're gonna blame the editor, right? Headlines are, I don't even know what the number of characters they are.
Yeah.
But they're short, right? And the point, y'all know what a headline is and what it does, right? It's to get your reader in, or a reader, listener, whatever, viewer in. Should we be accurate? Yes. Should we be accurate? And now these days, y'all much younger than me. Now, these days, you probably already do it. We have to do headlines too. We have to do the video, the photo, everything, all of it. That's not my skill set. That's not my expertise. So I struggle with that. I'm not gonna lie. I struggle with that. But also, it's important to me that my story is legit and that the headline goes with it and that it does what it's supposed to do, so that we're truthful in it. What are you asking me? Why do we do? How we should do it?
How do you
better?
fight back against an editor that's not doing
Oh.
good work by your headline?
That's.
I would say
Because I'm grown, y'all, and I've been in the news business a little bit, so I can push back. Don't y'all do some of this stuff, okay? Get yourself fired. I've been here a little minute, so I can say, no, that's not right, that's not fair. But if you actually, that's not true. In any position you're in as a journalist, you should push back if you need to. Be professional, be respectful, but explain why it is that you think that's not telling the story, or that's inaccurate, that's gonna mislead your reader. Because you don't want the reader to go in the story, it's not what you said. Because then they're gonna be pissed and mad and not gonna read the rest of it, and might not read the rest of your news organization, because you have lied to them. That's the last thing they need is for you, the credible reporter resource, to lie to them. So be honest. Get them in, y'all, but be honest about what you're getting them in to read. Okay? So they know what they're getting into.
Yeah, it's just important to advocate for yourself in that respect. There are constant battles in newsrooms between journalists and editors, pushing back on different headlines. But I do applaud certain social media that kind of gives you a warning to, like, before you share this, do you want to read this? Again, I don't think any of you do that because you're all great journalists, but these are things that we have to be careful. Definitely talk to our colleagues or our parents and our friends and family about. I said I talked about whether or not people get through the middle of the, past the first 2 paragraphs of an article, but do people get past the headline, which is usually salacious and meant to draw you in, as Deborah put. So again, reading the story is often very important, and it just goes back to news literacy. You have to do it with the intention, with the thought that I understand what this headline is meant to do. Let me just double check to make sure this article is on par with what the headline is saying. It's just a thing. This is competitive, it's a business, and everyone is trying to draw you in, usually about the same information. So it's sometimes a headline determines who you read over who you don't.
We talked about earlier, you used the phrase debunking, and we talked about fact checking in real time. The newest phrase, a new term, maybe other people have heard it before me, but pre-bunking, where you pre-bunk, essentially, you say what the truth is before the lie is widespread. Have you thought about just any of the panelists' thoughts about the term pre-bunking?
So
the appropriateness
this is
of that?
In general a big tech thing that happens. You see it on certain social media sites where they warn you this is happening, or this is being talked about before the end of the election, right? And here are some articles about why this might not or may be true. It is very difficult to do that as a journalist, right? Because our job is generally to put the facts out there, and the assumption is we have researched this for you and are not pre-bunking ourselves with, to pre-bunk misinformation because we're giving you disinformation because we're actually giving you the facts. But this is like a tech thing, and some of the examples you'll see is, like I mentioned, just a label with additional credible information. That's what that's doing. It's pre-bunking because the assumption is something is a little off on what you're about to read. So opening it beforehand, they kind of like warn you. And then I know Twitter used to do this. I'm not sure it does it now, but they either stop you from amplifying it by taking off the share button or the retweet button or even liking it. So those are some of the things that pre-bunking has done. Again, just to give you a sense of how much distrust people have in news, these are some of the mechanisms that have been implemented in order to help us read news better.
In addition to the specific kind of pre-bunking that Kadia referred to, there's also a generic one which is more in the nature of a type of information literacy program, which have been pioneered by a number of universities that have labs that and centers that work on internet issues, and I've looked at some of they've produced little videos that give people some general information, including some of the pointers that to us may all seem like no-brainers, like a headline isn't the same as an article, or an editorial isn't the same as a news story, but we can't take for granted that people know this, and so very clever designers have been designing very short, visually attractive and intriguing like tutorials that are only a few seconds long, so you can catch. Forgive me, they're concerned about the young people who are more oriented toward video and supposedly have a shorter attention span. And I've looked at some of them and they're really quite persuasive and powerful. And significantly, a study came out this summer that was done by communications experts at a number of top universities in the United States and in the UK and Europe. Google also participated in it. I don't know which way that cuts, but it was vetted by other social scientists who were convinced that there were some lasting positive impacts from viewing these kinds of general tutorials, if you will, and that what I thought was really interesting is that the positive impact was shown on people who had previously been attracted to certain conspiracy theories, but that the positive impact extended beyond the particular theory that they had previously believed. In other words, it made them more skeptical about all kinds of conspiracy theories. And since Adam mentioned AI, all media, including print media, can be used for good or bad, right? And the same is true for AI. So those of us who are concerned about making the optimal use of this powerful technology are very excited about recent studies that have shown that a so-called debunk bot has a new study came out just in September. Again, social scientists from top universities. And what AI is able to do that prior technologies were not is to assess the particular individual and what is the reason that this particular individual is attracted to a conspiracy theory, because people have different motivations, and a debunk bot was able to tap into what would work on an individual by individual basis. The New York Times had a huge story about it. I went and read the actual report, and it's really quite exciting because the positive impacts were shown to be much more long-lasting and durable than from previous technology.
Adam had a comment.
Yeah. Show of hands in the room. Have folks heard the term blue shift or red mirage? Some, maybe a quarter of folks. And so how to get things right and to spread information to the public when it's really important. Election night reporting, right? And so the question in this issue emerged in the 2020 election, especially when the Democrats were pushing vote by mail to keep people safe at home, COVID. Democrats are also clustered in cities where there are larger and more complex counting systems. It takes longer to count in cities and dense urban counties and dense suburban counties generally than it does in more rural areas. And so what's the dynamic related to that? That means that the votes in more conservative or Republican counties get added to the statewide list earlier in the evening. And things that come in on vote, if you're counting ballots later, or in some states, if there's a requirement you can't count the vote by mail ballots until after election day, they won't be added to the totals for certification processes until after election day. And so 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, looks like the Republicans ahead. That lead diminishes and sometimes evaporates and goes away in the days afterwards. Obviously, in the frame and the voting wars frame around fraud and the concerns and questions, people are saying, what's going on? These cities are coming, and you know who's in those cities, and they're stealing the vote. They're manufacturing the number of votes that are needed to catch up with the vote totals. You went to bed on election night, and you saw what the numbers were. This looks different. And so, to me, there was a huge effort to try to educate the public about the blue shift and the red mirage in 2020. It may be less this cycle because I think vote by mail will be a little less, and some states have, because of mis and disinformation, limited the access to vote by mail compared to the 2020 election. But that dynamic is really important when we're thinking in a pre-bunk context how to educate folks when it's really important to get the feelings right and to get people comfortable with waiting until the actual election, the counting process is done. Because nowhere in state law does it say that the counting process needs to be done by midnight on election day. That's unreasonable. It's not accurate under law. I think a lot of the media wants to know quickly, as soon as the votes are done, who won and who lost. But under the law and the canvassing process, certification of vote process, that is not part of the legal process for counting the actual votes in this. And so just when we think about when it's important to get the public prepared and ready for how to expect the vote coming in when it matters. Because people will try to take advantage on election night of who won, claiming victory, claiming defeat, pushing the courts or public opinion in one direction. It's super important on election night. The last thing I'll sort of toss in from maybe an advocate's point of view on pre-bunking and fact-checking as opposed to maybe how journalists would engage with it. From some of the research we and the other voting rights groups are doing related to countering election-based lies and misinformation, we do not share and repeat the lie in our social media. We have found that even when you say, this is a lie, this is the truth, and here's the lie that you should be wary of, if you even repeating that lie and saying it's a lie, it is sharing the lie, and it is giving the algorithm more feed for that lie, and is causing that to be shared in other places. And even if, when compared with the fact that it is a lie, people are reading and saying, oh, well, maybe that matches with what I view. We just say, this is the actual factual information. Election's on Tuesday, and this is the time. So don't, from an advocate's point of view, we don't share the misinformation, the disinformation. We just really push harder on sharing the actual accurate information around elections and voting.
Thank you, Adam. We're going to shift now to questions and answers. And if you have a question, just state your name and your school. And then ask your question. Do we have a microphone that we're passing around? I can just use this one.
You can take one of ours.
Okay, let's. Thank you.
Okay, does work. Hi, my name is Audrey. I'm the representative from American University, so right nearby. So in 2022, I spent a while with the Post working on a big story about election deniers. And there were a lot of them. And I'm just wondering how, and anyone can take it if they feel like they have an answer, but how we approach public figures or aspiring public figures differently. Because I know, you were saying, not to repeat the lie, but also when things are egregious and there's a lot of, I don't know, someone like a Marjorie Taylor Greene is actually being elected. How much do we pay attention to the crazy, and how much do we I don't know, not platform it? Also, really briefly, it is nice to meet you. I'm an ACLU camp alum. So.
What's the actual question? Sorry. How do we?
How
pushing crazy conspiracy theories, but also might be elected to Congress.
So one of the you probably see this a lot right now, where reporters are asking candidates whether or not they believe the 2020 election, whether Joe Biden, won the 2020 election. That has become standard practice, which is something that wasn't happening a few years before, right? Or whatever, the year before 2020. So that is one way. And just talking about election integrity and where they stand on it. But usually the standard bar is just asking them if they believe the 2020 election was stolen. It is incredible how big of a difference that makes, or what camp that puts that candidate in, depending on their answer. And often when they don't answer, that is also one of the biggest responses that you can hear. So that has been something I know that reporters have been doing.
And most, not most, some newsrooms, and I can speak to mine sometimes, we struggle with that. Do you give a person a platform but then who are we to decide who should have a platform, right? Mm-hmm. And we are journalists, and if we ignore and decide that we're not going to cover such and such candidate, is that right or wrong too? Should the reader, listener, viewer know what I'm not going to name a name. You named a name. What a candidate thinks or feels. They should know who they're voting for, or maybe not voting for, based on information that we provide to them. I'm not going to use the word objective because that's a whole nother panel.
Yeah.
But our job is to report the news, and if somebody is running for Congress, and this is their platform, we as journalists should share that information with the reader. Doesn't mean that we don't also do fact checking, right, in our reporting. That will make it a fair and accurate piece of journalism. I'm being very diplomatic here. I'm trying to write, but you understand, yeah. So
do you share every time that there's a crazy statement or?
No, we ain't got time for all that. First of all, right? And then we would literally. Some people talk for 2 hours at their speech. We're not going to cover 2 hours. We're not going to be there 2 hours. We're not going to do it every time either. But will we pull out what seems to be newsworthy and or counter and write about it? Of course. Same with on both sides.
We can go to our next question.
Yes.
If the panelists just kind of keep their comments just brief, just so we can get to so many questions as possible in our short period of time. Next, your school and your name,
Okay,
please.
perfect. Hi, I'm Ella Gonzalez. I'm representing Texas Christian University. And first, I want to ask what news sources y'all each trust. And then secondly, I want to ask how you think us as young journalists should use our platforms to spread more awareness about media literacy and just knowing misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation.
Kadia?
Just advice. Remember I said at the top of the hour, just really talk to, whenever your friends are sharing those things that aren't true, you should tell them that the more they share that, the more and disinformation they're going to receive because of the algorithm. That's just that's just going to happen. So it's up to you to say, well, I'm a journalist and that is not true. And you'll have these battles, as I do all the time, even with my friends who are much, much older than you are. I read, I read USA Today, the Gannett stuff. I read, we actually do a lot of aggregate in our, some of our newsletters, like Flagship, and the New York Times, the Washington Post. I think you are very clear about who is leaning which way, and, I will just name the newsrooms that I do. I'm a big print person because I just feel like there is just a different level of news gathering that goes into print as opposed to maybe television. So I am a big, and obviously I read Semafor because
I'd like to say that I do it on a journalist by journalist basis. Because the more you know about a topic, nobody can get it quite right, even if they're trying, right? But some do a lot better job than others. And I also use, please forgive me, very specialized publications that deal in an expert way with issues that I'm particularly interested in. So since I'm speaking on campus all the time, I start every day by reading the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Education, and I've developed a kind of a list of journalists who cover that with various newspapers, some major, some not so major, but I respect them as individuals.
Next question.
Oh, three quick election-specific websites, in addition to reading the amazing journalists on this panel and everything that's been said. VoteBeat, really interesting independent journalism with deep dive into elections, election administration. And they have both national and state-based reporters. Bolts Mag, they do criminal justice and election administration work and go deep on election certification laws, long-form pieces on that. And then electionline.org had been created by Pew, but daily puts up a curated and well-edited list of good articles sharing state by state the most relevant election-based news every morning by 7 a.m. You'll be able, if you care about a state, you can sort by state, and then some original reporting week by week. Those three, I would say, if you're election fans, places to go. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Nora. I'm representing the University of Pennsylvania. And one thing I wanted to note was, like, I do research on, like, headlines, for example, and, like, the impact of that on readers. And I guess I was wondering, from your guys' perspective, do you see the onus of combating misinformation on journalists being more careful with their headlines, or even just like in general reporting, or on promoting media literacy amongst the readers themselves? And how do you see those two working in tandem, those two parts of, I guess, addressing misinformation and addressing information in general?
I say both, but obviously people should have news literacy. Not only because they might be deceived by a specific headline, just in general, so they can make the distinction between an actual news article and, and a fake article that is derived by staff. So I think both, but I think it is very important. I think it is more important to have, because a news literate person is going to read beyond the headline no matter what.
Jaquel?
Hello, I'm Jaquel Spearman, the Houston-Tilson University representative, and my question is actually kind of a follow-up, so I'm glad she asked that. So how does the average education of America play in part of reading and understanding the news they are consuming? I'm wanting to ask that because we're all journalists, so we can read journalist jargon, but a lot of times most people don't have that news literacy to do so. So how would you guys how would you guys take in part of the average education of the American?
I think it's developing, right? I think you just talked about different.
Some states are really, but I think Jaquel's question was even more general. You're saying even beyond news literacy, there are other fundamental educational gaps. For example, I'm sure I'm the oldest person here, so nobody else may have this experience, but we used to have something called civics education that was required for people to understand how their government works, including how to vote and the importance of voting. And for some reason that I just don't get, that seems to have dropped out of curricula all over the country, and so that people don't even know that there are three branches of government. They don't know what the First Amendment is. How can you possibly care enough to even want to vote if you don't have that basic information? So I think Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman Supreme Court Justice, after she stepped down from the court, this became her life's passion to reignite knowledge of civics. And by the way, there is one group of people in this country who are incredibly informed about all of these matters and can vote, and those are naturalized citizens. And the New York Times every year will publish the questions that you have to answer for naturalization, and most native-born Americans would flunk that test.
And just, outside of like the political scope, just general news literacy, I think a lot of, I know Hunter College, where I did my Pulitzer program at, has since incorporated news literacy as a part of the core. Like, you have to take that before you graduate, right? So that is, and I think it is responding to the mis and disinformation that many students or just John Q. Public has to deal with. So I think it is growing because people recognize people don't know how to pass political news. People don't know how to get past an article. And we saw this all throughout COVID, right? Or throughout the pandemic, where there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that kind of guided people's opinions on whether or not they should take the vaccine. So beyond the political scope, it is just news.
I'm actually glad you brought up COVID. So since everyone's kind of been in solidarity, and this is how they've been getting their news via social media, do you think that's had a impact on the way they receive news now? Because we used to look at websites and things like that in terms of our news, but now that social media has become forefront in the way we receive our media, is that the reason why our attention spans are decreasing?
Sure. There's like, of course, like, I mean, how many of your friends or you get your news from TikTok, right? Which isn't the best source, like, despite how fun it is to be on for 4 hours. But yeah, that yes, attention spans, all of that. And this is something that newsrooms are constantly, and advocates are constantly trying to, just keep up to speed with, because it opens the door up for a lot of mis and disinformation.
Adam,
But
had a
let's be
comment,
clear-
and we'll go
oh.
to the next
Yep.
question.
Can I just add to, just be clear, the news organization, we use social media too. I mean, we can TikTok, everything. We all on it, because we too are using those vehicles to get to readers.
Yeah.
And so hopefully those sources can also be good places to go get.
Adam, and then we'll take another question. Adam had a comment.
I would say not wait to college, not wait to high school. My daughter just started 6th grade, Montgomery County Public Schools. She goes to a middle school that's 65% Hispanic. There's a Hispanic Student Association that had created a club for everybody, but it has brought in a Hispanic journalist to train the middle schoolers around journalism, to do their own independent journalism, to think about some elements of news literacy. And again, I was surprised to get that flyer from my 6th grader being brought home, and she's interested. She's doing the play, so she can't do it this semester. But to me, both the focus on representation from journalism and the fact that it's happening in such a young environment in public schools but it is taking the volunteerism of whoever they found, that local journalist, to come in and run that club to make that happen.
Can I put in the plug? Washington Association of Black Journalists is also doing a high school literacy program too. So we're bringing in the young folk to learn journalism now. Okay, that's my plug.
Hi, my name is Una Wilson, and I'm representing Wake Forest University today. When we're talking about truth in journalism, I think that a lot of my friends and peers, it's not that they don't trust the news, it's that they don't want to read it because it's scary and kind of depressing for a lot of them. A lot of people in my life, they don't trust that they're going to be okay. And so reading the news is more of a question of, do I want to have a bad day today, or do I want to feel okay about my life or myself? Because there's so many news sources, there's so much news, but a lot of it is, we're talking about headlines. It's catastrophic. It's hard to read and it's hard to digest, especially, during the pandemic and in the aftermath of that, and even the presentations we've seen with hurricanes, and it's a lot. And so I guess I'm wondering, when it comes to navigating information. What strategies do you guys think are useful, in reaching people, not just telling the truth, but, reaching them with that truth so that they want to hear it?
That is such an interesting perspective. Wow. Because it shows that what we have to do is, in some sense, even larger, and that's to deal with the psychological and emotional well-being of young people and give them a sense of empowerment. You shouldn't be, yes, you should be concerned and distressed and upset, but that will motivate you not to be depressed and anxious and want to avoid it, but the opposite, to be engaged. And so we have to, this may be a task way beyond journalism, but certainly for us who are educators and advocates, to give young people examples. I mean, history is filled with examples where the youngest people have made such a huge difference in countering the worst injustices. I mean, the civil rights movement in the South really was started by high school students and college students. And and more recently, we've had other examples of the anti-gun violence issues and on climate change. And I say this not at all as a pie-in-the-sky optimist, but as a student of history. And so I think, if you're reading the news from the perspective of this is a problem that I can do something about, and learning about it is going to translate into positive action that will make me feel really happy because I'll see the progress that's made and I'll meet wonderful people with whom I'm working. The tagline that I use under my email, and nobody ever reads down that low, but I love it. It comes from Cornel West, and he says that, and it was adopted by David Cole, who's the legal director of the ACLU, and I've adopted it from both of them, that optimism is more the result of activism than its cause. I mean, and then it becomes a virtuous cycle. But the more you are engaged, the more you have reason to hope. And you see that information as feeding your activism efforts.
There's also a trend towards something called solutions journalism. Have you guys? Okay. Yeah. Which is one way folks are looking to try to not just read something bad, but here's a way to help change it or make it better. And I think some of us are trying to do a lot more of that, not just show how bad it is, but what people are doing to try to fix it. So hopefully there's some hope.
Hello, my name is Katarina Portella, and I'm from San Diego State University. My question was for our journalists of the panel, but if either of you guys wanted to chime in as well. But I was wondering if you had any advice for journalists in covering political campaigns, and specifically advice for how can we relay this information in a clear way in something that can be so complicated for the average voter? Yeah.
Sure. So there's always a horse race, right? And everyone loves that, and that's fun. But there's also, looking at approaches about like what women are doing on the trail, right? Women candidates, right? There are whole fellowships that talk about sometimes you write a whole article and maybe you're not clear about who you're talking to. What are the women, what are the demographics there, right? Whether it's the ethnic demographics or the gender demographics. So looking at that and how those specific, like writing about a candidate through that lens is always like fun and new and fresh and exciting, because some people just like, go and they do the horse race part, right? They just report on who's up based on polls. But you can look at things through different lenses, and I encourage people to do that through gender, age, different lenses. It's just, like I know Joe Biden got pushed out of the election, he's no longer on the ballot, but also I think it exposed or gave journalists a bigger opportunity to look at like age in going forward and how impactful that is, even with this race right now between the two candidates. And you could do that on a local level also.
Try to keep it, y'all heard this in class, I'm sure. Keep it simple, keep it clear. And that's USA Today, that's our thing anyways, to try to not try to make it all complicated. Here's what it is. But also try to do some different stuff. I mean, last month, when I did it, I literally went out and signed up to be a poll worker, right? I write about poll workers, election workers, etc. But somebody said, why don't you go be one so you can see what it's like on the inside? Like, oh yeah. So I went and I did it. So I did it for 2 or 3 days being a poll worker, right? And so they let me do it first person to give a real feel. And then you kind of walk people through, the reader through what it was like. I went to training, I went to the poll site, this was like, and it was kind of a different way. I think it got a lot of clicks, I don't know. Got a lot of clicks, but it was just a different way to do basic journalism. And sometimes that could be a draw for people. It's like, you know.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, we have time for one. We're at our 3-minute warning.
Hey everyone, I'm Luis Fuentes. I'm representing Forsyth Tech in North Carolina. So you mentioned the Columbia protests, and that kind of reminded me of kind of the wider protests that there were going on, over the summer. Sadly, I was traveling, so I didn't get to cover any of them. And I can't speak for the whole United States, but I know a lot of local journalists and student journalists at my institution felt very discouraged in covering disinformation and misinformation that were going on during these protests, just because whether that be, the college itself or faculty or even other students, it just felt like they felt very powerless, and they felt like almost like they were being discouraged to kind of combat this information. So I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and how I guess student journalists should kind of empower themselves to.
Yeah, it's such an important question, Luis, and it pertains not only to student journalists but also to non-student journalists, because we have repeatedly seen that in excessive, unjustified responses to protests. So let me say, the right to peacefully, non-disruptively protest is core to the First Amendment. Yeah, if people engage in violence or threats, it's not protected. But there is consistently excessive, disproportionate crackdown, including by police officers, including at Columbia, in my view, which is targeted not only at the individuals who are protesting, but also at journalists who are attempting to cover the protest, and also legal observers who are trying to protect the rights of all of the above. So it does take courage. It shouldn't have to. And thank goodness, I keep everything in perspective. We know many countries where journalists are being killed and imprisoned. I mean, here you may get a jail sentence. It's not as bad as it could be, but it's on a spectrum that you are going to be targeted and punished for trying to exercise your First Amendment rights on the behalf of other people. And so I have to, just urge you to have that moral courage and physical courage. Call on the ACLU, the League of Women Voters. There are others there. We do win these cases in court. I mean, the law is very strong on this. You may have to suffer a little bit of time in jail, and I don't mean to trivialize that. But this is why I want to end by thanking all of you. You are really, your integrity, your courage, your principles, your eloquence, your commitment. The future of our democracy, liberty, and equality are in your hands. I'm so grateful.
Thank you so much, Nadine. We'll end there, and join me in applauding all of our panelists today.